Yeah, so thank you for the introduction. Today I'm going to be talking a bit about some of the phenological work I do. And the title of the talk is Using Plant Phenological Research to Manage Ecosystems in an Era of Global Change. So I probably don't need to go over the definition of phenology with all of you, but just to get us all on the same page, phenology is the study of seasonal biological events. Some examples of phenological events would be things like the timing of bird migrations, or when insects emerge or pollinate flowers, or plants flowering in spring, and then leaves changing color in the fall. And most phenological research really focuses on how the timing of these seasonal events changes from year to year. So these sorts of, extremely visible events have fascinated people for generations, right? People travel long distances to observe monarch migrations or fall foliage. And since they're so easily observable, phenological changes over time provide some of the longest records and most visible indicators we have of the biotic effects of climate change. And this is really important because shifts in the timing of phenological events, and then in this talk, I'll be focusing on plant phenological events, can have really far-reaching and cascading impacts on both important ecosystem processes like carbon sequestration and things like that affect human livelihoods too, like crop yields year to year, and even the length of allergy seasons can be impacted by plant phenology. And I'm going to jump through two different examples of how phenological research can benefit natural resources management in different ecosystems that'll hopefully be somewhat relevant to the Oregon oak ecosystems that you guys focus on. First, I'll show an example of how we can use community science to explore possible changes in how fruit ripening of iconic Northwestern shrubs with climate change may impact other management things. And then we're going to switch gears and talk about a current avenue of research that we're exploring that uses phenology predictions to manage invasive grasses. All right, so the first project we recently wrapped up when I was working in the Pacific Northwest Research Station for the Forest Service. And it looked at how climate change may impact the phenology of culturally important food-producing shrubs in the Pacific Northwest. And this project was funded through the USGS Climate Science Center. The motivation for this project came from a stakeholder interest in preserving and restoring culturally important plant species. So berry and nut producing shrubs like this huckleberry pictured here are important traditional foods for tribes in the Northwest region, and harvests and harvest festivals are really important seasonal cultural events. And these common food producing shrubs are also really important food sources for a number of animal species. And we know that climate change is altering the phenology of plant species around the world. But today, there's been very little research on how climate change might impact these specific shrub species, partially due to a lack of data. So again, looking at this is important because changes in the timing of flowering and fruiting of food-producing shrubs can have cascading impacts on the ecosystem, right? And for this project, we focused on 4 species based on interest from tribes in the Northwest region and also potential data availability. We looked at beaked hazelnut, Oregon grape, salal, and black huckleberry. Now I mentioned that there wasn't a ton of data available, or at least that the Forest Service had been collecting over time or anything like that. So a big push with this project was trying to collect and leverage publicly available data to create phenological predictions for these plant species. And we found out that phenological data can come from a lot of sources. So you can check out the US National Phenology Network or the iNaturalist website or online herbaria. And there's lots of potential phenology observations. And this is just a map of some of the observations we collected for black huckleberry from a variety of different sources. Many of the logos pictured on your left here. And our main sources of data for this project came from estimated dates of flowering and fruiting from images from online herbaria, like the Pacific Northwest herbaria here, and websites like iNaturalist, where users can submit photos of species to get them identified by experts. But in this case, we can take something like this, and it's a picture of the species in fruit. We have a date when this collection was taken, and we also have a location. Same with this iNaturalist photo. We know this is a black huckleberry. This can be a fruiting observation. And then we have the location where it was taken here and the date. And you can match these observations with gridded climate data. So we match locations and the timing of phenology observations to interpolated temperature data from DayMet, another publicly available climate data source with interpolated weather data all over North America. And we did this for all observations taken since 1980. That's when this climate data first came around. And then we summed daily temperatures for each observation to calculate growing degree day models or thermal sum models for each species. And these phenology models are based on the assumption that plants need to hit a certain threshold of accumulated warm temperatures before phenological advancement to the next stage, like bud burst or flowering or fruiting. And they're one of the oldest ways to predict plant phenology. They've been used by farmers for centuries and by many phenological researchers like myself now. So after we calculated thermal sums for all species, we can project the day of year a phenological event is estimated to take place based on temperature data from that year. So here is an example of a map of the predicted dates of fruiting for black huckleberry in the year 2010. We've clipped these predictions to a map of the estimated current range of black huckleberry. You can see at lower latitudes and altitudes, there's earlier predicted fruiting dates, whereas at later or at higher altitudes and latitudes, you would get later fruiting, which is what we observed. So we then took these growing degree day models and compared them to future temperature predictions to see how phenology may change moving forward. And for this, we used those basic multi-model climate ensembles that climate scientists always talk about, with a low-end, low-emission scenario and a high-end emission scenario. But for the results, I'm just going to show you the high-end emission scenarios on this next slide. All right. So here are maps showing the projected change in fruiting dates for each species by the end of the century. And again, each one of these maps is clipped to the predicted range of each species by the end of the century. And across all species, we're predicting that fruiting may advance by 10 to 55 days, with those higher or greater advancements again occurring at higher altitudes and latitudes, and a mean advancement of 36 days across all species. So these are pretty drastic predicted advances, right? And of course, these predictions are based solely on temperature changes here. Other factors like the date of snow melt or day length or precipitation could influence fruiting in reality in the future. But at the very least, I'd say these predictions would give cause to start regularly monitoring the phenology of these species to see how realistic they might be. And on that note, we were curious if we could find any longer term records for any of our species to compare these pretty stark predictions to. We did find one long-term record of flowering observations of Oregon grape taken by Wilbur Bloom from Salem, Oregon. And these are also publicly available at the website here. He started recording phenology of various plants around where he lived in Salem in the early 1960s. And he reported Oregon grape flowering from 1960 all the way through 2016. So if you simply graph his yearly observations, it shows that flowering of Oregon grape has already advanced on average by 5 days per decade, with flowering occurring an average of 50 days earlier now than it did in the 1960s. And again, this is one record of one species in one place, but it shows that the kind of large shifts in phenology that we're predicting in the future may already be occurring. And it really highlights the importance of keeping these long-term records. So to summarize, our models predicted large shifts in phenology of shrubs from a week to almost 2 months by the end of the century. And these large shifts have the potential to greatly alter trophic relationships, plant pollinator actions, and the timing of harvest and traditional harvest festivals in the future. And I think these models can serve as a basis for targeted monitoring efforts to evaluate how climate change is actually impacting important shrub species. And hopefully these predictions can also be used to identify geographic areas where climate change could significantly impact flowering and fruiting of edible shrubs and help managers determine suitable locations for restoration projects in the context of climate change. And we have all of these results as interactive maps with also range prediction results for the 4 species. And we also have bibliographies and information for 20 or more additional edible shrub species in the Northwest, all available at this website here. And you guys can email me after this talk and I can send you all of these web links. And I think they'll save this talk too. So they're really cool interactive website. I definitely encourage you guys to check it out. Okay, and then I thought I should put something about oaks in this talk. This is really preliminary work, but I'm working with some colleagues to examine how the phenology of catkin production of valley oaks, so in Central California, influences acorn crops. So it's not the right species of oak, but it's probably a similar phenological process that goes on here. And we're using a really nice long-term data set that was collected by my colleague and Walter Koenig at the Hastings Natural History Reservation in Central Coastal California, these valley oaks here. And they have been collecting phenological observations of trees at that reservation since 2003. And Koenig found that more synchronous flowering occurred in warmer years, and that led to greater acorn production. You can see these graphs here. This is the day of catkin formation of individual trees. Each dot's an individual tree plotted against year. And in 2007, for example, the trees all flowered around the same time, and there was greater acorn production shown in this graph over here. However, in 2015, you ended up with much earlier catkin formation in some trees, but also a longer period of flowering. And this actually led to lower acorn production. So if you get, cold weather and then a warm spring and all the trees flower at the same time, you get increases in acorn production. But if you start getting warmer temperatures year round and really, really warm temperatures in early spring with some genotypes flowering earlier, perhaps you'll get a longer season of catkin formation, increased risks of frost, and eventually lower acorn production. And this is maybe something we should be worried about for the future. Okay, so there's my oak stuff. And then the last example I'm going to talk about is still very much a work in progress as well. And it involves using phenology forecasting tools for the management and detective of invasive grasses. So as Tip Hudson was already talking about, and I'm sure you're all well aware, exotic annual grasses are some of the most ecologically and economically damaging invasive species in the world. And they're tricky because they can invade native ecosystems following fire and then create these invasive fire feedback loops where they completely transform ecosystems. And their phenology here is really what gives them an advantage, right? They grow earlier in spring than natives and they use up limited resources. So combating large annual grass invasions to preserve native ecosystems is really a top management priority here where I am in Colorado and then throughout the Great Basin and also where you guys are up north, the Columbia Basin. And with the research we're doing, now we're asking if we can take advantage of these phenological differences between invasive grasses and natives to help manage invasions. This is important because they're already a huge issue in sagebrush steppe ecosystems, but they're becoming more and more abundant at higher elevations as well. Cheatgrass is becoming a larger problem near where I live in Colorado, and this is a photo from higher elevations in Wyoming. All the red area you can see here is cheatgrass after a recent burn there. And I imagine they are probably a top threat to native Oregon white oak habitats as well. So grazing, mowing, or applying herbicides when invasive grasses are active and native plants are dormant is one effective method to damage exotic species without harming co-occurring natives. And Tip Hudson did a much more thorough job talking earlier about how active management of grazing can actually benefit rangeland ecosystems when done correctly, even though grazing also is one of the reasons we have so many issues with invasive grasses in the past. So I have colleagues with the USDA Agricultural Research Service who have established a long-term range experiment in southern Wyoming, where early evidence from this experiment actually suggests that grazing can be effective for reducing cheatgrass abundance. They found that cattle preferentially graze cheatgrass patches prior to seed production. So when the cheatgrass is green before it forms seeds, cattle will eat that rather than the native plants in this, Wyoming ecosystem. But then they avoid those patches after cheatgrass has gone to seed and dried out because the seeds are ouchy, and when it's dried out, there's less nutrients. So it's really important to time the sort of timed grazing correctly, right? You want the cows out early when the cheatgrass is green, prior to it flowering, and prior to when the native grasses are really starting to get going. So you can impact the cheatgrass without impacting the native species as much. So we're trying to use past phenological observations of cheatgrass to help predict the optimal timing for management prior to flowering across the landscape scale. And predicting cheatgrass phenology can also be relevant for remote sensing applications. And that would be used to map invasive grasses. And using remote sensing to monitor and map annual grasses is really promising because, again, these grasses green up and dry down at different times of year than native species, so their spectral signature is different. And they can easily be detected by satellite imagery, and then maps can be made. However, again, choosing the correct time periods to pull satellite images from in a given year can be tricky. These grasses green up and die down, months difference in different years, and this varies a lot on temperature, elevation, and also latitude. So predictive pheno forecasts that give an estimated range of the peak greenness or senescence of these grasses could be utilized to help select satellite images from time periods when the phenology of the annual grasses and natives is predicted to differ the most. And you could do this across large latitudinal and elevational gradients. All right, so the data sources we're using for these models, beyond the publicly available phenology observations that we will use similar to the shrub models, are time-lapse cameras. And these cameras are pretty cool. They take multiple pictures per day. You just put them somewhere and leave them out for a year. And they can be paired with temperature data loggers at the site to get both accurate dates of flowering and accurate local temperature data to help parameterize models. And we're hoping that using these cameras in conjunction with the more numerous but also the messier phenology data from publicly available sources will give us kind of a unique opportunity to test whether models based on fewer and more accurate observations outperform those built on more numerous but less accurate observations. This is just a picture of the camera set up near me in the Front Range of Colorado. And then here's a little video, hopefully it works, to show an example of time-lapse camera images from one of the cameras we did put out last spring near Boulder, Colorado. And I'm guessing by this point in the day, you've been to a lot of talks and have heard that there's nothing more exciting than watching grass grow. At any rate, if you know what to look for, it's really easy to identify the exact date that these grasses start flowering and also the exact date that they start to dry out and turn red. So these kind of data points may help us make more accurate predictions to make more accurate models for future phenology. The next steps after we get these accurate predictions will be to make these predictions widely available to the public. We've been working with the USA National Phenology Network to try to get funding to eventually use the cheatgrass phenology models in conjunction with forecasts of driving climate variables to produce daily updated forecasts for the date of flowering of cheatgrass. And these will be very similar to maps that have been produced already for the emerald ash borer that are available at the USA National Phenology Network, and that are used by managers to predict when these insects will emerge and when it's time to treat them. Here's another hopefully interactive map showing how these predictions change over the course of a given year. I think in this case it's 2018. And these kind of visualizations are great because they're easily accessible and can also provide a way to receive continuous feedback on the accuracy of predictions. So when people who are interested in this kind of stuff can look at a prediction map and look out their window and see that that's not actually the case, and they can give us that feedback, this sort of helps improve models over time. And these kind of forecasts using iterative models that are continually updated with newer and better data, this is how weather forecasts went from being really bad in like the 1950s to being, like somewhat better today. So I think it's also kind of the next exciting step that we can do for ecological forecasting or forecasting of biological events. All right, and then I think I'm going to end a little early too, but I'll wrap up here with one last plug for these models that will hopefully be in production soon. The phenology predictions we create for cheatgrass can be extended to multiple other invasive plants with time-sensitive management windows. And then these phenology predictions can be used in conjunction with species distribution maps to help managers address both when and where to focus management efforts. And some of my colleagues work on this really cool Inhabit tool that has a bunch of invasive plant distribution models. It's available at this website down here. And if you are a manager of a certain plot of land and you're interested to see what invasive species or invasive plant species may potentially be there or have, predicted to have pretty good habitat there, you can check out this website for, I think, over 70 species now. And an example of how the phenology and the species distribution models can be used in conjunction. Here's an example of a run for the estimated date of cheatgrass flowering in 2012. And this is, clipped to the extent of the predicted cheatgrass distribution. And you can zoom in, say, to an area of interest. And here you can see the predicted date of flowering across this region. So flowering between May 7th and June 17th here. You could also toggle between just the species distribution and the probability that cheatgrass would actually be present in any of these areas from low, medium to high. And this is, again, available here. The phenology pheno forecasts are not available yet, unfortunately, but hopefully soon we'll have them both on the same website. All right, so if all of this talk's gotten you really excited about phenology, which I hope it has, I highly suggest you check out the National Phenology Network, the iNaturalist website, and also the Consortium of the Pacific Northwest Herbaria site. They're all amazing. You can contribute observations to them. And if you already have contributed observations to them, I would like to thank you here. These platforms and these community science observations really are integral to my science, especially when funding is tight, which it always is. Yeah, and with that, I think I have time for questions if you want to discuss this more.